Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. Thanks for joining us for another study in our series on 1 Samuel. Earlier, we had read of Saul's apprehensiveness of his new role as king, as well as the misgivings of some of the Israelites who wondered whether or not Saul would be able to be the one to deliver them from their enemies. In today's section, chapters 11 and 12, we're going to see how Saul fulfills the people's primary idea of what a king should be, someone who would fight their battles, as they said in chapter 8 in verse 20. So it begins today with the threat from the Ammonites. In verses 1 through 4 of 1 Samuel 11, we read that Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you." But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, "I will make it with you on this one condition, that I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Let us alone for 7 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. Then, if there is no one to deliver us, we will come out to you." Then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke these words in the hearing of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now, the Ammonites were neighbors of Israel. In fact, they were kind of sort of related. They were the descendants of Lot and his youngest daughter's incestuous act back in Genesis chapter 19. They occupied this territory that's east of the Jordan River, east of the territory that had been given to Gad. And we read more than once in the book of Judges where the Ammonites had been a source of trouble to the Israelites. In fact, there are going to be lots of throwbacks to the book of Judges in today's lesson. We'll make some note of those as we notice them. But it seems that Ammon, in this instance, is taking advantage of what they think is Israel's weakened condition to try to maybe reappropriate some land that they believe ought to be theirs. And so the Ammonites' leader, Nahash, dictates some pretty tough conditions on Israel if he's going to let them live. He wants to gouge out their right eye. And he says it's going to be a reproach on them. But on Nahash's part, this is actually a pretty strategic move. Not only would it be a shame to the Israelites, I mean, to have your right eye gouged out by your enemy is a pretty big deal, but it would still leave them, although somewhat impaired, it would still leave them in condition to be able to do some agricultural deeds or whatever it was that he wanted them to do in order to supply him and his nation with food. That's usually what they would do as tribute. If they couldn't afford to bring money, then they would farm and they would give him the proceeds of the things that they farmed. So it would have reduced their ability to wage war while keeping them still fit for agricultural work. And they make a deal with him. "Let us send help. Give us a week," they said. And maybe that's because they thought that they would send help to Benjamite territory. That's where Gibeah of Saul is. Now, they artfully negotiated for more time. Jabesh Gilead was just on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and they had to go across the river and head over into Saul's territory. Now, they didn't necessarily immediately send word to Saul. They went and it said they told the people, and the people lifted up their voices and wept. But it makes sense, I think, that they would send word to the Benjamites. Relatively not long ago, Jabesh Gilead had failed to show up to fight against Benjamin in an Israelite civil war, and that's captured for us in Judges chapter 21, another throwback to the book of Judges. And because of that, the women from Jabesh Gilead were forcibly taken as wives for the Benjamites. And so it seems that maybe they felt some kind of kinship with them. And it was natural for them to reach out to Benjamin for help. Now, we had read back in chapter 10 that there were some men who had already begun to follow Saul. And so he had the beginnings of an army. And it's going to be the beginnings of his, what I'm calling, spirited success. And you'll see why in just a moment. In verse 5, it says, "Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. And he said, what is the matter with the people that they weep?" So here, right off the bat, we see that they didn't go right to Saul. They went and they told their kin in Benjamin what was going on, and Saul finds out about it later. But we see vividly still the uncertainty of Saul in his role as king. Instead of assembling a group of advisors, of making plans for Israel's future, he's behind a plow. He's gone back to farming. But before, when he was looking for his father's donkeys, remember, he was portrayed as kind of an incompetent shepherd. Well, now he's an unsure king. And the people don't go right to him because, don't forget, this is a nation in transition. They've never had a king before. Well, they did. It was God, but they never had a human king before. And they're not sure how this whole kingdom thing is supposed to work out, although Samuel had given them some instructions about that. So they go and they tell their kin. They don't go right to their king. And the king himself really hasn't begun to formulate plans about what to do. But when he hears about it, everything changes. Let's keep reading. The end of verse 5 says, "So they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. And he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces, and sent them through the territory of Israel by the hand of the messengers, saying, Whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. Then the dread of Yahweh fell upon the people, and they came out as one man. He numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. They said to the messengers who would come, Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, Tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you will have deliverance. So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. And then the men of Jabesh said, Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you will do to us whatever seems good to you. And next morning Saul put his people in 3 companies, and they came out into the midst of the camp at the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. And we'll stop there. When news came, Saul sprang into action, or rather the Spirit sprang into action. It says that the mighty Spirit came upon him, or the Spirit of God came upon him mightily. And that's indicative language, because where this kind of language has been used, again, back in the book of Judges, it means that it foreshadows a victorious outcome. There's imminent military victory. The same kind of language is used of Othniel, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson back in the book of Judges, and the victories that they had against Israel's enemies for God. And we see where Saul sends out this message. He cuts up this yoke of oxen into pieces, and he sends it out to Israel. And interestingly, he invokes Samuel's name. Join Saul and Samuel, he says. Now remember, before we had read where although Saul had been appointed king, Samuel was still very much in charge. And so apparently Saul wanted the people to know that Samuel has given his approval, although there's no indication that he had even spoken to Samuel. But he wants to incite the men to action. And so he musters this army that itself is very impressive. In verse 8, it tells us that he numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. I don't know if that's a total of 330,000, or if the 30,000 of Judah were in the 300,000. But that's an impressive sized army for this small nation. In fact, it's the second largest numbering of Israel's army that we read about. The largest was 400,000, again, back in the book of Judges, when Israel came to fight against Benjamin. And not only is the numerous army impressive, the place that they choose is strategic. It says in verse 8 again that he numbered them in Bezek. Now, Bezek was across the Jordan River from Jabesh Gilead, about 10 miles or so. And so everybody kind of musters for the battle here at Bezek. And it tells us that the strategy that Saul comes up with is to gather or to separate the army into 3 different companies. And it's not hard to see why. They would be able to spread out and surround the enemy army. And it tells us that they had done this in the morning. Verse 11 says, the next morning, Saul put the people in 3 companies. Now, that tells us something. By doing this in the morning, maybe early in the morning, would have lent them the element of surprise, so that by afternoon, the battle is theirs. It's victorious. And the people of Jabesh Gilead never forgot this act by Saul on their behalf. In fact, after Saul dies, let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 31. Saul dies in battle, and his body was just desecrated by the enemy. And I want you to read what the people of Jabesh Gilead do about that when they heard of it. In 1 Samuel 31, in verse 11, it says, when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, that's a Philistine city, and they came to Jabesh and buried them there. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. The inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead never forgot what Saul had done for them. And when we go back to 1 Samuel chapter 11, we see that all of Israel is in approval at this thing that had been done. In 1 Samuel 11 and verse 12, it says, the people said to Samuel, who is he that said, shall Saul reign over us? Remember, that's what happened back at the end of chapter 10. Some men it says some worthless men were asking, can this one really deliver us? Well, now they want to know where these guys are. They say, bring the men that we may put them to death. But Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel. Then Samuel said to the people, come, and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. And there they also offered sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Now there's some significance to the city of Gilgal, and you can see it there towards the bottom left of the map that's on your screen. Gilgal was the first place that Israel, when they entered the land, had set up as their headquarters, as their camp. They would go off and do battle, and they come back to Gilgal. Well, they go there, and this assembly at Gilgal has kind of a festival feel to it, right? They're convinced now that Saul is the one to fight our battles, right? To seek, and because of that, they begin to seek retribution of these naysayers, the ones that we read about at the end of chapter 10. But Saul, in a generous gesture, not only spared the lives of those men, but I want you to notice how he gives credit to God. At the end of verse 13, he says, today Yahweh has accomplished deliverance in Israel. Now, we see something of a character beginning to emerge in Saul. Sadly, it's not going to last. But we see something of a bright shining spot here at this place in Saul. And so Israel thinks that they have everything they want in a king, somebody who would be successful in defending the people against their enemies. Surely everything's going to be okay now, right? Well, maybe. Let's keep reading. We read in chapter 12 of Saul's final address, where he begins this final address to the nation as he relinquishes power to the king. The first thing he does is he talks about his own faithfulness to God and to country. In verse 1 of chapter 12, it says, "Then Samuel said to all Israel, Behold, I've listened to your voice and all that you've said to me, and I have appointed a king over you. Now, here's the king walking before you. But I'm old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. And I've walked before you from my youth even to this day. Here I am. Bear witness against me before the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? I will restore it to you." They said, "You've not defrauded or oppressed us, or taken anything from any man's hand." Then he said, "Yahweh is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you have found nothing in my hand." And they said, "He is witness." Now, Saul says in verse 3, "Here I am, bear witness against me before Yahweh and his anointed." And he uses that term, his anointed, twice to great effect, to get them to realize that although they clamored for a king, God was the one who selected the king for them. And before he relinquishes this leadership, he says, "Here's the king." He reminds Israel of his own faithfulness to them. He was not only faithful to God, but also to his own integrity. And he asks this series of questions. Who have I cheated? Who have I defrauded? He asks he phrases it an interesting way at the end of verse 3, "From whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it?" Now that's picturesque language of what bribes do. They'll conceal the truth from someone, or to someone. They'll blind the eyes of someone who's willing to look the other way for a few shekels. And Samuel asked the question, who can answer? Who can bear witness against me? And of course, he's lived his whole life trying to do what was right for God by his people. And they can't find anything to say against them. And it's another one of those glaring reminders of the difference between Saul and his own sons. Back in chapter 8, verse 3, we were introduced to Saul's sons, and it says, "They did not walk in his ways." Now, we've seen that Samuel's way is a way of integrity. I keep saying Saul, I mean Samuel. The way of Samuel is a way of integrity and rightness, of duty and responsibility. And sadly, Samuel's sons weren't like that. But Samuel stressed his own faithfulness. And not only that, but he spoke of God's faithfulness towards Israel. Look with me, if you will, as we continue in verse 6. It says, Then Samuel said to the people, "It is Yahweh who appointed Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. So now take your stand, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord which he did for you and your fathers. When Jacob went into Egypt, and your fathers cried out to the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt, and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God. So we sold them into the hand of Sisera, captain of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried out to the Lord and said, We have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, and Bedan, and Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you into the hands of your enemies all around, so that you lived in security." And we'll stop there. Because Yahweh is also witness. Remember, he said before, it's God who is witness and also his anointed. Because the Lord, God, is witness of Samuel's faithfulness to Israel, it's right that they should be reminded of God's faithfulness. And so he frames this address in judicial language. He says that God is witness in verse 5. He says, take your stand in verse 7. He says, plead before the Lord in verse 7. This is judicial language. He's telling them, if you've got a case against me, bring it. And then he reminds them of God's righteous acts. And when he spoke of God appointing Moses to bring them out of Egypt, he uses their most famous example of oppression, supplication, and then deliverance. And he also notes that God had acted through human agency, just as he had done throughout the period of the judges. We'll look at that in just a moment. But I want you to notice something. In verses 9 and 10, there are these phrases that come up. But they forgot the Lord their God. In verse 10, they say, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord. Those are words that are straight out of their recent past. Again, more throwbacks to the book of Judges. In Judges chapter 3 and Judges chapter 2 and Judges chapter 10, we're told again and again how Israel had forgotten God, how they had forsaken the ways of the Lord. And because of that, God had allowed one of the prescribed penalties that they had agreed to in the covenant. Make a left with me to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy. We're going to look first in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Deuteronomy 28. In Deuteronomy 28, beginning in verse 25, God through Moses tells them of what they can expect if they turn aside from obedience. It says in verse 25 that the Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them. And you will be an example of terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. In verse 29, he says, you will grope at noon as a blind man gropes in darkness, and you will not prosper in your ways, but you shall only be oppressed and robbed continually with none to save you. Look at verse 33. A people whom you do not know shall eat up the produce of your ground and all your labors, and you will never be anything but oppressed and crushed continually. This is what God said they could expect if they turned aside from him, if they disobeyed the covenant. And they were warned that this would happen over in Deuteronomy chapter 31. Go there with me. In Deuteronomy 31. In Deuteronomy 31. In verse 16. It says that the Lord said to Moses, behold, you're about to lie down with your fathers, and this people will arise and play the harlot with the strange gods of the land in the midst of which they are going. And they'll forsake me and break my covenant, which I have made with them. Then my anger will be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them and hide my face from them, and they will be consumed. And many evils and troubles will come upon them, so that they will say in that day, is it not because our God is not among us that these evils have come upon us? But I shall surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they will do, for they will turn to other gods. So because they forgot God, because they forsook God, God had warned them of what would come upon them if they did that. Well, back in 1 Samuel chapter 12, there are 4 more examples to come through men whom God selected that were a result of their crying out to him. The name Jerubbaal comes up, and of course that refers to Gideon. That's another name for Gideon. Bedan, the only place where Barak, who assisted Deborah in defeating Hazor, comes up. Jephthah and Samuel, these men whom God had selected to help them. And as we continue in verse 12, he says, when you cried out because of the Ammonites, he says, you could have cried out for another deliverer, but instead you clamored for a king. And so again, at the end of verse 12, Samuel uses that phrase, here is your king. Here's the deliverer that you cried out for, the king that you think is going to take care of everything. And so he goes on to give them an admonition of what they can know concerning God and his faithfulness. he reminds them that God had rescued them, that he looked out for their needs, that he was always caring and concerned for them, that he selected the human deliverers who would judge them or deliver them from their enemies. But he wanted them also to know that their defeats and oppression came as a direct result. It was due to their sinfulness and their rejection of God. And yet, in spite of all that, he says, God was faithful to you. And we know through our reading of the Judges of that vicious cycle that dominates that book. A cycle where the people would fall away and they would follow other gods, just as God warned Moses that they would. They would be oppressed and afflicted by foreign invaders. And then they would cry out to God, and they would come back to him for a little while. And then God would send a deliverer who would quiet the land for a variety of years. And then they would start to fall away again, and that whole cycle would repeat itself. But yet through all of that, God was faithful. He follows that up with an admonition. Beginning in verse 12, he says, when he saw that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us. Now, that tells us something. It implies that the harassment that the Ammonites were giving to the Israelites were happening even before they had asked for a king. So this had apparently been going on for some time. He says, you said a king shall reign over us, although Yahweh your God was your king. Now therefore, here's the king, whom you have chosen, whom you asked for. And behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him, and listen to his voice and not rebel against the command of the Lord, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your king, or rather the Lord your God. If you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you, as it was against your fathers. Even now, take your stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is not the wheat harvest today? I will call to the Lord, that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord by asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. You see how often the name of God comes up here, Yahweh, again and again and again. Of course, it's translated Lord in your Bibles, but the punch is the same, right? He wants them to realize that God is the one you need to depend on. God is the one you need to look at. And they've got to realize that when they sin against him, then bad things happen. But he wants them to know that in spite of the fact that they had sinned in asking for a king, they could still enjoy blessings. And he says there are 4 things you need to do to make sure that you do enjoy these blessings. He says you need to fear him. You need to respect him. You need to revere God. And of course that means that if you're going to fear him, then you're going to serve him. You're going to make sure that you do what needs to be done. And that comes by listening to his voice. And listening, of course, implies more than just hearing. It's the heeding, the hearing and the heeding of God's will. And most importantly, he says, don't rebel against him. He says in verse 15, but if you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. And they'd seen that happen again and again and again, how when their forefathers had rebelled against God, how God's hand was heavy on them. And this was not new information. From the very beginning, this is what God had told them he expected from them. In fact, it was one of the very last things that Moses had reminded their forefathers. Go again with me to the book of Deuteronomy, this time chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30. As Moses delivers a series of final addresses to Israel, he says really the decision is simple. You can make this decision by realizing what's at stake. In Deuteronomy 30, and in verse 15, Moses said, "See, I've set before you today life and prosperity and death and adversity, and that I command you today to love Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But if your heart turns away, and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You will not prolong your days in the land where you were crossing the Jordan to enter and to possess it." And so he pleads with them to choose life. Well, we know the rest of that story, right? And it seems as we read in 1 Samuel chapter 12 that Samuel's frustration seems to boil over. In verse 16, he says, "Even now take your stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes." And he calls to God for a rainstorm. In the middle of their harvest, he says, "Is not the wheat harvest today?" Now, the wheat harvest was an important time, certainly because it provided their food for them. But it was imperative that the wheat stay dry so that it wouldn't mildew, so that it wouldn't become worthless. Weather conditions have always had an impact on the people and were seen as signs of either God's pleasure, rain when they needed it, or displeasure, rain either withheld or when they didn't need it. And such a sign, a rainstorm during the dry season, this was their dry season, the harvest season, would be a divine demonstration that they would need to learn from. And so Samuel calls for this rainstorm for added punch, for them to realize that God is ready, he is willing, and he is able to deal with your disobedience. The whole thing is a lesson that Samuel dearly hopes they wouldn't forget. But then he reassures them. In verse 19, it says, "Then all the people said to Samuel, 'Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, so that we may not die. For we have added to all our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king.'" Oh, finally they get it. They finally realize that they've sinned in asking for a king. And Samuel said to the people, "Do not fear. You have committed all this evil. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart." So he reminds them at the very beginning of some key things. It worked, right? They realized their sin, but the deed is done. The king has been selected, and he says, still there are some things that you can do. Do not turn aside, he says. A neat thing to do, if you've got time, is do a concordance search, or if you've got Bible study software, just do a search in the Old Testament for the phrase "turn aside" and see how it's used again and again and again of turning aside from God's will, from God's way. He says, "You must not turn aside," in verse 21, "for then you would go after futile things which cannot profit or deliver, because they are futile. For the Lord will not abandon his people on account of his great name, because the Lord has been pleased to make you a people for himself." Now Samuel says God won't abandon you. It's because God has a reputation of faithfulness to uphold, and he has chosen you to be his people, so he will stick by you. And we continue in verse 23, where Samuel says, "As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, but I will instruct you in the good and right way." Samuel says, "I will intercede for you." And he says, most of all, in verse 24, "Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you." Remember, he says, what God has done. Think about how God has delivered you again and again and again. And this is the big point of Samuel's farewell message. He reminds Israel of all that God had done for them. He goes all the way back to the Exodus and moves through snapshots of their history. And yet, the people had repeatedly forgotten God. They need to realize that God is all they need. They need to stop looking for more. Their pursuit for more will only culminate in life disasters for them. And he says in verse 25 that if you still do wickedly, both you and your king will be swept away. In this nation that's in transition, Samuel reminds them that the people's and the king's fates are tied together. Both the people and the king are obliged to obey the will of God, or else both of them will be swept away. And of course, it's a grim foreshadowing of what's to come for later on, the divided kingdom, the north in 721 BC, as they were taken captive by the Assyrians, and then later on, the southern kingdom of Judah in 587 BC as they were captured by the Babylonians. This nation in transition is at a crossroads. And I always wonder how different their history might have turned out if they'd taken a different path. Well, next time, we're going to talk about the battles of the king that they have selected, how he fought those battles, and how sometimes his worst enemy was himself. Well, thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll do it again. God bless you.